Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 1st of August. So, by this point, you should have uploaded your first speech and sent me your speaking outline. And I would have contacted you if you uploaded your speech onto Moodle but did not send your speaking outline to my email. Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. So I'm waiting on receiving those outstanding outlines before I evaluate the speech. But for those of you who submitted in both the speech and the outline, you should have received your feedback. So you can see I used the template that I had included with our syllabus and course outline, and I would have scribbled a few notes and a letter grade. In terms of the outline, I would have reviewed the outline and evaluated it on a checkmark scale. So plus is excellent. Check plus is very good. Check is satisfactory. Check minus is less than satisfactory. And a minus is unsatisfactory. And we will be doing the very same thing when it comes with speech 2, except for speech 2, I don't even use a template. I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses, which I will be sending to you. So we are now preparing for speech number 2, which is going to be due this Tuesday on the 6th by 11:59 p.m. So you know this is a very condensed class, but the good news is that the class ends on the 15th of August. So, in terms of informative speeches, which is what speech number 2 is going to be, you have 3 chapters that I suggested could be of assistance to you. The first being on supporting materials. Now, you're not going to need to use outside materials for speech number 2, but you are going to be required to do so for speech number 3. So I thought it was better to talk about it sooner rather than later. You'll remember speech number 3 is going to be the persuasive speech. That said, I suspect most of you will be talking about in your informative speech something that you already have some knowledge about. So you may or may not need to consult outside resources, but I thought I would talk about it today in the event that you do decide to consult outside resources for speech 2. But you will all be required to do so for speech 3, the persuasive speech. Visual media, and that's one of the ways that the second speech is going to be different than the first speech. You were not required to use audio or visuals for your first speech. Certainly you were encouraged to, but what I wanted you to focus on in the first speech was incorporating the elements that we've been discussing thus far in terms of speech delivery. So introduction, discussion section, conclusion, eye contact, body language, things of that nature. So now that you've had some practice doing that with a subject that you have a strong amount of familiarity with yourself, then we can use that as a springboard to practice some more complex skills, which would include using an audio and or a visual. Since basically the informative speech, it requires you to teach the audience about something. You will have twice as long as you had with the autobiographical speech. The informative speech is 10 minutes long. And that said, as many of you found with the autobiographical speech, there's no way in this short amount of time that you can talk about everything. So you're going to have to pick and choose and think, of course, about your audience and their needs. And that said, the chapter on speeches to inform can give you some perhaps ideas on how to proceed with choosing a topic for your informative speech. Today, in addition to the 3 chapters that I've assigned, I also have your second quiz. It'll be very similar to what you did with quiz 1. I just suggest that you copy and paste it into a Word document and that you give brief answers, and your 20th question, the last question of the quiz, is going to be what is your topic for speech number 2, and what are you planning for using for an audio visual. Of course, you're not necessarily committed to follow that, but at this point in the semester, I hope you've got a good sense as to what it is you're going to be doing for speech number 2. And that informative 10-minute speech, I've in the notes below, under the second section, giving you 2 examples of informative speeches by students like yourself. And you can see that one of those speeches, the first one labeled A, was actually filmed live to a classroom presentation, while the second one wasn't. And as we know from watching sample speeches and also watching the speeches of our peers, which I will talk about shortly, there is no such thing as the perfect speech, but this might give you some ideas of topics or ideas how to proceed with the informative speech. As I had suggested, some of you might want to pursue a topic that you raised in your autobiographical speech, but some of you might want to do something completely different. Some of you might want to talk about a topic in the informative speech that you will pursue in your persuasive speech, or perhaps you'd like to do something completely different. So, for the informative speech, you are going to talk about, as the textbook has suggested, perhaps a person, perhaps a place, perhaps a thing, perhaps an event, perhaps an idea, perhaps a procedure. And you could think about papers you've written in the past that are informative that you could adapt for this assignment. You could think about curriculum that you've studied in the past or are studying now that you can adapt for this assignment. You could think about your own interests and hobbies that you could relate for this assignment. You could decide to learn something new for this assignment, but of course we know that we don't have a whole lot of time, so you don't have much in the way of preparation if you are going to be teaching yourself something new. And the informative speech can either be an explanation, this is where you're telling the audience something, or a demonstration, you're showing the audience how to do something, or perhaps a combination of the two, and there's strengths and weaknesses to each. You do want to limit your points. You've got only 10 minutes and you don't want to overwhelm your audience. You do want to use transitions. Those are particularly important when you are trying to teach the audience information so that they can hear and see the connections. And it's one of the reasons why I'm asking you to use an audiovisual, because of the different learning styles that individuals have. And some of your audience members will learn best through oral information, but others will learn best through visual information. And you can see that I try to get both of those modalities by providing you both with oral and visual information with my own classes. Of course, when you're doing a demonstration, the advantage is that the audience gets to do something. This can be, however, tricky, especially in a video format, much like we're doing, because you're not going to have the exchange with the audience going back and forth. So, trying to anticipate audience questions and address those audience questions becomes particularly important when you are not presenting live. Avoid jargon, specialized language that is known in a small group, but not necessarily through the whole. Again, you want to assume a general, albeit educated audience, your classmates, in effect. Cluster-like ideas. It's a wonderful technique for memory, for you to remember something or for you to teach us how to remember something. Group things that share commonalities. Associate the old with the new, an old teacher technique that you've probably seen many times, where you talk about material that's well known, perhaps in a mathematics class, and then you build upon that. Use repetition as one of the best ways to help memory is by repeating. And again, these are tips you can use for yourself in terms of presenting, but tips you can offer us to help us remember. It's one of the reasons why advertisements oftentimes are so powerful, and that we remember them just because we've had so many repetitions of the same information. And sometimes you need to motivate your audience. Sometimes there's already internal motivation within the audience. But, when you think about how some subjects might be less appealing than others, I believe I shared with you the story of one of my former students who shocked the audience, or attempted to shock the audience, by having a live simulation, not that we knew that it was a simulation, of a classmate choking in class. And what that led to, after we found out that it was all a simulation, was that the speaker's topic was going to be, for his informative speech, the Heimlich maneuver, which could be considered to be a bit of a dull topic that might not necessarily have a lot of audience interest. But now, all of a sudden, because we had experienced an episode where we ourselves were confronted with whether or not we were familiar with the Heimlich maneuver in terms of helping one of our peers, then the subject became much more interesting and much more valuable. So, that said, in terms of visual media, there are lots of different ways you can go about using visual media. Some of it will depend on your topic because some topics lend themselves better than others to visual and audio media. Some will depend on your audience. Some, again, visual audio media might be more or less appropriate for your particular audience. And of course, some of it will be based on personal preference. And you can go from low tech to high tech. You know, you can use something like a whiteboard. You can use something like a picture. Pictures tend to work very well in terms of evoking emotional responses. You can use posters. You can use props. You can use audio or video clips. You can use a flip chart, which was actually a kind of pre-PowerPoint where we would have information on large pads of paper, usually on an easel, and then we would decide when to flip the page, hence flip chart, to reveal new pieces of information, which is basically what PowerPoint does. Zoom screen sharing. These are just some of the few ideas that you could use for an audiovisual. I stopped counting after you've used one audiovisual, but you can use as many as you like. And obviously, you're going to have to think about the circumstances that you are presenting on video rather than presenting to a live audience. So, what is the best way for you to share that information? You want to make sure it's something that's visible to your audience, but you don't want it to obscure your speech or your appearance. So, for instance, PowerPoint is perfectly fine, but remember, we are not evaluating your use of PowerPoint. We are examining your public speaking skills. So, we want to make sure that we can see your face. PowerPoint should be the small square, not the large square in the video screen. And you want to think about timing and balance as well. With the 10-minute speech, I would say no more than 3 minutes of audio visual, if that. If you were giving an hour speech, then perhaps you could give 10 minutes of an audio visual. But again, that wouldn't work with the 10-minute speech. We want to mostly see you deliver your speech. You might want to think about how you are going to relate your information in a different format for your audience that's most effective with this modality of recording. So, some pieces of audiovisual possibilities, let's say the handout, might not necessarily be in your best interest. That said, you can always still show a picture, but what's the best way to do that? Are you going to do that as a projection on a screen that's behind you? Are you going to do that by holding up, let's say, a picture to the camera? And if so, will it be visible? So there are lots of details that you need to work out. But regardless of what you decide to do be professional. I mean, we have a certain level of expectation in our society today. We've got enough technology and enough access to venues where we can have technological help so that you expect something that's professional, not something that's just scribbled on a piece of paper. You definitely want to test your equipment beforehand and be prepared for mechanical failure. And that said, it's a little bit different when you are presenting live because you are presenting in the moment and you need to think quickly on your feet. But even if you're recording, again, you want to record with enough time so that if you did experience technological difficulties, you would have enough time to resolve it. There is a reason why I record these classes and post them or attempt to do so the day before they are supposed to be posted, just in the event that I'm experiencing some sort of technological issue that gives me a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of time to try to solve it. As I had suggested with the first speech, I think having a paper outline is very useful so that you don't have to rely on technology, which could fail you. And the outline is there merely as a assistive tool. You should not be reading verbatim your outline. You might not even need to look at your outline if you are very familiar with the subject matter. Think of the outline as a kind of guideposting of the major points that you should be discussing. And no one in the real world would see your outline outside of you. So you can deviate from your outline, but the difficulty of deviating, much like deviating from a map or a GPS set of directions, is that you have a greater opportunity to get lost. So you need to be very careful with that. As you know, I'm asking to see your outlines, which should be keywords and phrases, so that in the event that you did need to skim your outline, you're not going to be spending too much time avoiding eye contact with your audience because you want to be as conversational as possible. Charts are very good for numbers. Numbers can be very difficult to conceptualize. Pictures, as I had indicated, are very good with emotions, and we tend to be a combination of the two, both emotional responses and also intellectual responses. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat, you want to consider the scale, nothing that's too large or too small. You want to use balance and proportion. You want to use color for interest, but you don't want to overwhelm us. What I call, if any of you have ever seen this, PowerPoint gone wrong. Another way of thinking about this is just because you can, that doesn't mean you should, where someone attempts to use all of the possibilities with PowerPoint and it just becomes way too busy and it's impossible for the audience to read. Again, the idea of the PowerPoint is to supplement, not to substitute for what it is that you are doing. Avoid all capital letters. So if you are going to be presenting information, yes, you can capitalize words, but you're capitalizing only those important words. If everything is in all caps, and I can tell you there's probably no English teacher on the planet who has escaped having to read at least one paper written in all caps. It is very difficult to read. And you certainly want to proofread very carefully, especially if it's something that you are going to be highlighting, let's say in a poster or in a sign or in a speech, because the audience will be paying more attention. So if there is an error, then it's more likely that the audience will focus on the error. And studies have shown that if you want to get your audience's attention, the better way to do it is by bolding rather than underlining important pieces of information. You can test that with yourself to see if you find that to be the case. I had suggested to some of you with your outlines that you might want to bold important words or phrases just to ease skimmability of your outline. And as I said, you're not required to use supporting material for this speech, but you will be for speech 3. So this is information that you can keep for the future. And we'll talk a little bit more about speech 3 when we get closer to that point. Definitely supporting material, outside resources, helps to increase credibility and also persuasiveness. It's one of the reasons why you're using it for the persuasive speech. You need to check for accuracy. And of course, we live in an interesting time. We've never had more information and we've never had less information, in that most people will immediately go to Google and take the first few hits and use that to formulate their argument. And I have nothing against Google, but there are many better ways to find valid pieces of information. Google is run by algorithms based on popularity, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those algorithms also reflect accuracy. This is going to be my opportunity to encourage you to use the GCC library resources. Yes, you can still use books. Yes, you can still use magazine articles. Yes, you can still use paper. or you can also use the GCC databases that appear to be like Google searches, but they're not, because these databases basically have employees to review the accuracy of the information that happens to be posted electronically. And no, you cannot access this unless you have a subscription, which is why everybody goes to Google, because it's free. And most of us don't have the resources to have private subscriptions, but academic institutions do. Your tuition dollars at work. So, as a GCC student, you have access to using things like our databases, where you can use electronic searches that have a higher level of accuracy. Again, you don't want to necessarily assume that just because it's in a database, it's correct. You want to verify everything, especially in today's world of artificial intelligence and fake information. You want to rely on your brain. But certainly there is more accuracy or more likelihood of accuracy in getting information from a database than on the open internet. And you'll see in the notes below in the 5th section, I've included the link for the GCC library system, and you can access that anywhere, any place. One of the advantages to being a GCC student. So I encourage you to do that if you need to find information. And our librarians are trying to make themselves as accessible as possible if you have questions about information. And they also are able to assist with some technology questions. So you can email them and you can chat with them and you can phone them. You can even see them in person if they are near enough to you. So I encourage you to take advantage of that resource as well. If you're using a resource, you want to use some sort of a verbal cue or flag that this is not your information. We do the same thing when we're writing, but it's much more complex when we're putting together a written argument, because usually what we have to do is give lots of pieces of minutia. So it may not be within the body of the paper itself, and maybe in the works cited page, but we want to include things like publisher and place of publication and page number and website address and things of that nature. Now, when you're speaking, of course, you want to be conversational. So if you are delivering a speech, you don't necessarily want to inundate the audience with all of those pieces of information, but you do want to make them available to your audience in the event that your audience were to ask you to provide that information to you, whether it's in a live situation or an electronic situation. You certainly don't want to make up resources. But basically, your cue or your flag could be as simple as saying, according to experts, and that basically is the cue that the information that I'm going to provide after that is not my original research. That belongs to something that's outside. And of course, I could provide additional pieces of information about who those experts were, at what university, and what date the study was done, and who was the publisher and the place of publication, if you wanted all of that information. But for the actual verbal speech itself, it would probably be enough to give less rather than more, because again, you don't want to bore your audience or overwhelm them with minutia. And there are lots of different ways that you could think of outside resources. People usually think of things like websites and books and magazine articles and newspapers, but an interview, for instance, can also work as an outside resource. Again, the trick is, who is your interview subject going to be? It should be somebody that has some ability to add value to your speech, somebody who has a certain level of expertise, perhaps, in the subject matter. You want to be as ethical as possible. We've talked about ethos. You want to make sure that the person you're interviewing knows how you are going to use the information you are gathering. You have their permission to do so. You have their permission to share their contact information or their name, or you are going to offer a pseudonym. So these are the things that journalists oftentimes have to consider when they are interviewing their subjects for articles. And different kinds of evidence have different kinds of values. One is not necessarily better than another, but qualitative evidence, which is based on anecdotes and stories, very useful. The eyewitness account. But quantitative evidence, which is based on facts and numbers, also very useful. And usually what we get is a combination of the two. Again, you've got only 10 minutes, so you may not necessarily be able to hit all of the bases in terms of using lots of different resources and using qualitative and quantitative. But think about, how oftentimes we ask about student experiences at something like GCC, and that's qualitative, it's anecdotal. But then we also look at things that are quantitative at GCC, things like graduation rates, for instance, or class completion rates. And again, it's not that one is better than another, it's a combination of the two. And the different kinds of evidence we might use: first-hand primary accounts, again, eyewitnesses, and obviously they have a lot of value to offer because they were there. But also secondary accounts, which are usually based on primary resources, scholarship, for instance, where you're putting together all of the eyewitness accounts, let's say, of a particular event, and then you're writing a book about it so that you're an expert in this field. So that means that what you've been doing is getting as many firsthand accounts as possible and compiling them together. And of course, there are pros and cons to each. The firsthand account obviously is real, for at least for that person, but that person could be mistaken, that person could be lying, that person could have forgotten something. And the secondary accounts, of course, scholarship is always very useful, but just because a scholar's written a book about war, that doesn't necessarily mean that they truly understand war if they haven't fought in a war themselves. So again, pros and cons. So in terms of today, what are we going to do? I wanted to try to keep this video on the shorter side because you have two tasks ahead of you. The first is taking quiz 2. And that is an open book, open note quiz, and you can see that in the notes below. Again, I asked you just to copy and paste that into a PDF and send that to my email at Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by Saturday the 3rd. But also for your attendance question, this is going to be a little bit different because usually you do your attendance question on our discussion form. I'm going to ask you to submit in your attendance question response to my email. And the reason why is because I wanted to leave a certain level of privacy. And what you are going to be asking to do, or what I'm asking you to do, and you can see that in the notes below, is I'm asking you to watch all of the speech number 1s that were posted by your classmates. And they are in the top Moodle section where you would have posted your own speech. And you don't need to necessarily watch your own speech, though certainly you can, but I want you to watch the speeches of your classmates, which is what we would have done if we were meeting in a face-to-face class. And I'd like you to send me, very briefly, a strength and a weakness for each of the speeches that you viewed for your classmates. It can just be a word or two. Basically, I wanted to compile all of that and to present to you in a future class what the class as a whole seemed to think was a strength and weakness for your speech. I, of course, would have already given you your feedback, or will be giving you your feedback if I am waiting on your outline. But this is the part where you get to not deliver speeches, but listen to speeches. One of the best ways to learn how to deliver a speech is to see how other people deliver them. So you get to watch your classmates. And again, I just ask that you send that to my email, and that is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. You can just put that in the body of the email if you'd like, or whatever is fine. That should be due by Saturday the 3rd. Again, if you need additional time, please ask me for an extension. But obviously, as a condensed class, we don't have a lot of time, so I'd like to be able to put all of this together and be able to present it to you before you actually have to deliver, well, speech number 2, which is going to be on Tuesday. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And certainly if you have any questions about speech number 2, or you wanted to run by drafts with me, or even meet, let's say, electronically, please let me know. If not, I will have all of the information available for you by Tuesday, if not before, for you posting speech number 2. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.